I need your ID. Now. The voice came from above him, close enough that Daniel Brooks didn't look up right away. He paused with the coffee cup still in his hand. He didn't drink. He set it down carefully, the lid clicking once against the rim. Steam lifted and faded before he moved again. The book on the table stayed open. Same page. No crease added. He hadn't turned it since he sat down. The man standing over him waited. A nameplate caught Brooks' eye when he finally looked up. Officer Tyler Grant. The letters were scratched slightly at the edges, like they'd been rubbed clean too many times. Brooks stayed seated. The space between them was already closer than it needed to be. Close enough that Brooks could smell cologne layered over cold air from outside. Grant's boots were angled inward, not blocking the aisle outright, but enough that stepping past would have required a pause and a decision. Brooks lifted his eyes slowly. "Am I being detained?" he asked. Grant didn't answer. He shifted his weight forward instead, letting the silence sit. Then he repeated the instruction, slower this time, as if repetition alone carried authority. Brooks glanced down at the cup, then back up. He didn't raise his voice. For what reason? Grant's eyes moved briefly across the cafe, then returned. He offered a vague explanation that didn't attach to anything in the room. As he spoke, he reached out and slid the book a few inches to the side with 2 fingers, clearing space on the table like he was rearranging something that belonged to him. "You won't need that right now," Grant said. The book made no sound when it moved. Brooks watched it shift. He didn't touch it afterward. His hand stayed on the table, palms down, fingers loose and visible. He repeated the same question, word for word. Grant didn't respond to the question. He labeled the behavior instead, his tone flattening. At the counter, Emily Carter noticed the change before voices rose. The cafe had gone quiet in the specific way that happens when typing stops but screens stay open. She wiped her hands on a towel she hadn't used and walked over, stopping just behind the chair. "What's going on here?" she asked. Grant didn't look at her right away. "I've got it," he said. "Step back." Emily hesitated. Not long. Just long enough to glance at Brooks before answering. "We didn't call the police," she said. "He's a customer." Grant turned toward her then. His eyes passed over her name tag and kept going. "You let people like this sit around here," he said. Emily's mouth opened, then closed. She steadied herself and spoke again. Shorter this time. "There's no issue," she said. "And we have cameras." That information didn't change Grant's position. He turned back to Brooks and pointed toward the door without stepping aside. The instruction now involved movement. Brooks looked at the hand, then at Grant's face. "Is that an order?" he asked. Grant didn't answer. He reached down and placed his hand around Brooks's wrist. Not tight, not violent. Just present. Enough to register. The effect was immediate. A chair scraped softly somewhere behind them. Someone shifted their feet. At the next table, a phone was turned from face down to upright. The screen still dark. Brooks didn't pull away. He didn't raise his voice. He asked the same question again. Grant let go after a moment. But he didn't retreat. He stayed where he was and spoke as the decision had already been made. "That's refusal," Grant said. Brooks looked at the space where the hand had been. "What command?" he asked. The question went unanswered. Grant's radio crackled. A few seconds later, Sergeant Laura Mitchell entered the cafe. She didn't speak right away. She took in the spacing first, where Grant was standing, where Brooks' hands were. The fact that Brooks was still seated. "What's happening?" Mitchell asked. Grant answered quickly, stacking broad explanations without settling on one. Mitchell listened, then turned to Brooks. "Sir," she said, "can you show some ID so we can end this?" Brooks didn't reach for anything. "I'll follow lawful orders," he said. "I just need the reason stated." Mitchell glanced toward Emily. "Has he been asked to leave?" "No," Emily said. "He's welcome here." Mitchell exhaled. The decision wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Disengage, she told Grant. There was a brief hesitation. Then Grant stepped back. 1 foot, then the other. Next time, he said. Cooperation saves everyone time. No one responded. Grant and Mitchell left. The bell over the door rang once and stopped. Brooks stayed seated. He took another sip of coffee. It had cooled. He asked Emily for the officers' names and badge numbers. He asked whether the cameras covered the area from before Grant entered until after he left. They do, Emily said. Please preserve that footage. Brooks said. She nodded. I will. Brooks wrote the time down on a napkin, folded it once, unfolded it again. He closed the book without turning the page and remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. Nothing else happened. The record, however, had already begun. Daniel Brooks didn't leave right away. He stayed seated after the door closed. After the bell rang once and stopped. The cafe sound returned in pieces. A chair pulled back. A cup was set down. Someone resumed typing. Slower than before. Brooks folded the napkin again and slid it into his pocket. He didn't look at it. He already knew what he'd written. Emily Carter moved behind the counter and opened the security panel. The screen showed the room from 3 angles. Entrance. Counter. Seating area. The timestamps ran continuously. Brooks asked her to note the time the officer entered. Then he left. He didn't ask her to interpret anything. He didn't ask what she thought it meant. He only asked her to keep it. I'll save everything from before he walked in, Emily said, and nothing gets overwritten. She added after a beat. Brooks nodded once. He finished his coffee and left the cup on the table. He didn't take the book with him when he stood. He picked it up only after pausing long enough to check the cover. Same page. Still unread. Outside. The street looked unchanged. He walked 2 blocks before stopping. He took the napkin out, unfolded it, and rewrote the times more cleanly in his phone. Entry. Initial contact. Physical contact. Supervisor arrival. Exit. No adjectives. No commentary. That afternoon, 3:18 p.m., he sent the first request. It was short and direct. Preservation only. Body-worn camera footage from Officer Tyler Grant. Dispatch audio. CAD entries. Radio traffic. Any supplemental reports or revisions. He didn't ask for conclusions. He asked for records. The next morning, 9:07 a.m., Emily emailed confirmation that the cafe footage had been exported. 3 files. 3 angles. Time-stamped. One attachment was labeled HS Cam 2 MP4. She included the file sizes and the storage location. Brooks replied with a single sentence thanking her and asked that the originals remain untouched. The department's incident report arrived 6 days later. Grant's name was on it. The language was broad. Non-compliance. Suspicious behavior. Officer safety. Brooks read it once. Then he opened the timestamps and read them again with the clock running alongside them. The sequence didn't match. 2 days after that, a revised report appeared. The wording was tighter. The justifications are cleaner. The timing adjusted. The timestamp still didn't move. Brooks placed the 2 versions side by side and saved them as separate files. He didn't annotate them. He didn't correct them. He let the differences exist. Another request went out. This one included metadata, edit histories, access logs, upload times. The response took longer. When the body camera footage arrived, it confirmed what the cafe cameras already showed, but from closer range. The initial demand came before any articulated reason. The reason shifted as the questions stayed the same. The physical contact happened without a stated basis. There was a pause in the footage where the audio dipped. Then it resumed. Brooks noted the timestamp. He didn't speculate. He forwarded the materials as a package. Not to the media, not to internal affairs alone, to a review channel that handled patterns rather than single complaints. Grant was reassigned to patrol pending review. The notice didn't say why. It didn't mention the cafe. It listed administrative reasons. When Brooks asked whether the reassignment resolved the matter, the reply was brief. "This is still under review." The email read. The review widened. Other stops involving Grant were pulled. Similar language appeared across reports. Similar phrasing, similar sequence, reason after demand, compliance framed as resistance. The pattern didn't require interpretation. It required alignment. Investigators requested additional material. Old cases, dismissed complaints, footage retention logs. Some files were missing. Some had been overwritten. Others had access timestamps that didn't match policy. That changed the scope. Brooks was contacted for a statement. He provided one. It matched what he had written on the napkin. No additions. No framing. When asked why he hadn't identified himself at the cafe, he answered once. It wasn't relevant at the time. Months later, Brooks received notice that the matter had been referred for federal review. The letter listed statutes, but it didn't summarize conclusions. It outlined the scope. He placed the letter in a folder and labeled it by date. He didn't speak publicly. He didn't post anything. He didn't contact reporters. He waited. By the time subpoenas were issued, Grant's original report was no longer the focus. The revisions were the timing, the access logs, the gaps. The cafe footage stayed the same. So did the napkin. Nothing dramatic happened next. What followed was paperwork. Interviews, cross-checks, timelines adjusted to match clocks rather than narratives. The case didn't grow louder. It grew heavier, and it no longer belonged to the cafe. The case didn't arrive in court as a story. It arrived as a sequence. The first filings focused on scope, not outcome. Dates, statutes, jurisdiction. Exhibits are labeled and cross-referenced. The cafe footage was entered as third-party video. The body camera footage was entered with its metadata intact. The reports were entered in multiple versions, each preserved as received. Nothing was merged. Nothing was summarized. The comparison did the work. The timeline showed the demand preceding the justification. The revision history showed language tightening after footage preservation requests were logged. Access records showed who opened which file and when. Gaps were noted. Overwrites were time-stamped. No single element carried the case. The alignment did. Daniel Brooks appeared when required. He didn't sit at the center of anything. He confirmed the times. He confirmed actions. He confirmed that the napkin entry matched what he later wrote into his phone. He didn't add emphasis. When asked whether he felt targeted, he answered only in terms of sequence. That was the order of events. He said. The prosecution didn't frame it as a bad encounter. They framed it as a pattern. Stops with vague justifications. Commands were issued before reasons were stated. Escalation triggered by questions rather than behavior. Reports written to reverse that order after the fact. Revisions were made once it became clear that the video existed outside departmental control. The defense focused on discretion. On judgment calls, on stress. The files didn't change. The cafe footage played without commentary. Brooks remained seated. Hands visible. The officer stood too close. The book moved. The instructions shifted from identification to movement without a stated basis. The body camera footage played next to it. The language didn't match the timing. The audio dip was noted. The report language was compared line by line against the footage it claimed to describe. The revisions were displayed in sequence. The court didn't react outwardly. It took notes. The verdict didn't hinge on the cafe alone. It hinged on the handling of records, on the decision to adjust official reports to justify actions already taken, on the use of authority to manufacture compliance after the fact. Officer Tyler Grant was convicted on multiple counts, including civil rights violations and falsification of official records. Sentencing followed weeks later. The court referenced pattern, not impulse. Duration, not a single morning. Impact beyond one individual. Grant was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The number was read once. No additional explanation followed. The room stayed quiet. There was no statement from the department that day. No press conference. A written notice was released hours later confirming the conviction and noting that Grant was no longer employed. Other cases tied to his reports were reviewed. Some were dismissed. Some were reopened. Some remained under examination. Some records were formally corrected to reflect the video rather than the original reports. Several civil cases were resolved quietly after review, without trial. The city acknowledged the financial cost in filings. Without detailing individual outcomes, the process moved unevenly, file by file. Brooks wasn't named in most of the coverage. He didn't correct that. He returned to his routine. The folder from the Federal Review stayed where he had placed it, labeled by date. The cafe footage remained unchanged. The napkin was kept with the rest of the record. Nothing about the ending felt dramatic. It felt final. Not because power had been confronted in the moment, but because it couldn't rewrite what had already been preserved. That was the difference. If you were in that cafe, would you have noticed when the book was moved? Would you have thought to record or to ask the business to keep its footage? If stories about accountability through records, timelines, and evidence matter to you, share this, leave a comment, and subscribe to Power Abuse Stories.